Hey guys, welcome to video 2 of Genuine Agreement. Let's talk about that word genuine for a second. I mean, what does genuine mean? It means real. It means authentic. It means truthful, right? So it's a real. It's an authentic. It's a truthful agreement, right? That's what makes it a genuine agreement. So this part we're going to talk about fraud. What you know about that word fraud, you can guess what you already know. Meaning, fraud means to lie. If you're a fraud, you're a liar, right? If you're committing fraud, you're lying, right? And so that's kind of what fraud is about. So this chapter, this section of the chapter, we'll talk about how you prove that a contract you entered into was induced by fraud. What it takes to prove that you were a victim of fraud. And also on the other side, the knowledge of this will help you so you don't defraud somebody else in a contract, right? Because if you do, there's lawsuits involved. There's you can be sued. There's jail sentences, right? I mean, think about a common a recent fraud case was the college admission scandals, where some famous people made up bogus claims about their kids to go to these fancy colleges, right? One like on the rowing team or a tennis star or something like that. And it turned out, and they were getting money to go to these prestigious colleges for basically free, and they didn't earn it, right? It was fraudulent claims. They were paying people to get their kids into these universities, and not only these people went to jail. Some famous people, Felicity Huffman being one. The lady Lori Loughlin, I think her name is, from what's the show with the Olsen twins were in it? You guys know the show I'm talking about. John Stamos. I can't remember the name of the show. Anyway, we're talking about going to jail, right? So let's talk about what fraud is. Fraud is a deliberate, meaning on purpose, deception to secure an unfair or unlawful gain. You're lying for your benefit, right? So, persons who are induced into fraud, you have two choices. Meaning, if you are the victim of fraud, you have two choices, right? You can rescind the contract, cancel it, and, in some cases, you can sue for money damages, right? So, cancel the contract. Rescind means cancel, or you can and you can sue for money damages. So let's talk about what fraud actually is, and how you protect yourself against fraud, and how you know you're not committing fraud. Now we're going to talk about each one of these bullet points individually. So we'll just kind of fly through these here. We'll talk about them real quick. And then we'll talk about them individually, all right? To succeed in a lawsuit for fraud, a party bringing the suit has to prove all these things. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 things. You have to prove all 5 things for you to win a fraud lawsuit. The first thing you have to prove is that there was a false representation of fact. We'll talk about what that means in a minute. The party making the representation must know that the representation they're making is false. They lied on purpose, basically. The false representation must be made with the intent that the person was going to rely on that false representation. In other words, take it to heart, right? They're lying on purpose, and that person kind of falls for it. Right? The next one is the innocent party must reasonably rely on the false representation. We'll talk about that in a second too, because that can get a little tricky. And the innocent party must suffer some monetary loss. There has to be a loss, right? And so let's talk about these individually, and we'll start with what a false representation of fact means. False representation of fact. It's a material fact is something that's important to one of the parties. It's something of importance. So, for example, if I say, has this engine been? I'm buying a vehicle. Has this engine ever seized up? Or has this car ever been in an accident? Right? That's an important fact to me. Right? And if the person I'm buying it from says, nah, and they say, nah, never been in an accident. Right? Well, that's a misrepresentation of an important fact. Right? So some other, I don't know if you guys have ever watched Ferris Bueller's Day Off, and they borrow the Porsche, right? And the Porsche goes and to show that they didn't take the Porsche, they went and tried to get the odometer to go backwards, and it went shooting out the garage door, out the garage window, and off a cliff. Well, things like turning back an odometer or painting over rust, all right, these things can be false representations of facts. Some actions can be false representations of facts. If you go to buy a house and you say, hey, do you have any termite damage or no termite damage? That's a false no termites here at all. That's a false representation of fact, right? Even if something that important, if it's really important, and you don't tell the person about it, that could be a false representation of fact as well. You have termite damage in the house you're selling. You know there's termites throughout that house, right? And you sell it anyways and you don't tell them. That's called concealment or non-disclosure, right? And that could be a false representation of fact as well. The party making the representation must know that it's false. If I didn't know there was termites, I said, there's no termites. Then I didn't know, right? Then there's no lawsuit for fraud. If I did know and I was lying on purpose, all right, then that's fraud, right? So making a lie on purpose, right, about something that's material or important, you could have fraud. When you lie, or when the person lies to you, they are lying to you knowing that you are taking their word, all right? That's false representation intended to be relied upon. You lie to them with the intent that they're going to rely on your word. Right? And then the next one is you actually do rely on their word. So in other words, if I come, I say, listen, you have termite damage in this house? They're like, no. I don't know if they're lying to me on purpose. No termites here. No termites in this house. But then I have an inspector come in. I didn't rely on their word. Right? I didn't rely on their word. So, it actually has to be relied upon. Sometimes persons will make misrepresentations to other and they pay no attention to them. Right? That means if they pay no attention to it, it wasn't a material fact to them. If so it has to be, the false representation actually has to be relied upon. You take the person's word that the car's never been in an accident. All right, you rely upon his word. All right. If I bring it to a garage or I have a friend come and say, "Has this car ever been in an accident?" Or I run a Carfax, right? I didn't rely on their word, right? And the last one is, there has to be a loss, right? There has to, the innocent party, the person who was lied to, had to suffer some kind of monetary loss. Because if there's no harm, there's no foul, right? So there has to be a loss there. Sometimes you can make out in the deal, right? So say you wanted to buy a 68 Camaro. The guy lied to you and said, no, this is he said, yeah, this is a 68. Turned out it was a 67. He lied to you on purpose because he knew, and the car had more value than what you paid for it, right? Well, then you didn't lose anything. You gained, so there's no fraud, really. So there has to be some kind of loss. So just a quick recap of that. I know I went through that really quick, but it has to be a false representation of fact, right? They lie on purpose. They rely with the intent that you are going to take their word. You do take their word, and you suffer a loss. All right, those are the elements of to prove a lawsuit. And if you do, just any kind of quick Google search, here's common types of fraud that are out there: telemarketing fraud. Nigerian letter fraud. That's when somebody calls and kind of says, "Oh, you have a distant relative who's gotten in trouble with the embassy, and they want you to send money." All different kinds of things. Identity theft, paying for something in advance and then the person never comes and does the work. Healthcare fraud. It's billing for healthcare visits that never really happened. Mortgage fraud. Debit card fraud. Somebody steals your debit card, right, or your credit card, right? That's considered fraud. Lottery fraud. So charitable contribution fraud. These are all different types of fraud. And if you just do a quick Google search here and hit news, these are the fraud cases that are in the news in the last 24 hours, right? People trying to steal the coronavirus stimulus checks, right? Great. That really brings out the best in people. In a time of crisis when people are trying to rip other people off, that's really it's really a solid person there, right? Businesses trying to rip off, the business